Okay, so in this video we're going to look at how we can take this new landform that we've tiled and applied different types of panels on it and begin to render it out using a variety of colors and materials that we can begin to even edit in Illustrator. So we're going to use a combination of some display styles in Rhino and Grasshopper as well as in Illustrator. And you'll see from what I have right now is that I really just got two components turned on. There's the ruled surface, which is creating this extruded wall between the original hexagon and the new scaled hexagons. And then there's the fragmented patch, which is creating that capped extrusion as well. So the key thing to keep in mind with this step is to utilize the color to create hierarchy, right? So we can see that the majority of change or transformation in our landform are happening on our steeper conditions. They've become smaller, they get extruded out a little bit more versus the areas that are really flat don't do a lot of change. So it's important to draw the attention and focus to the areas that have the most transformation. We don't really have to worry too much about the ruled surface or these extruded hexagons. I really want to draw more of the attention to the new scaled one. So for the purpose of that, I'm just going to go ahead and bake this directly into Rhino. I've got a specific layer just for that, so I'll hit OK. Turn the preview off so I can see it a little bit better. So now you can see I've just got a basic material baked into Rhino. Because now I want to actually start to assign different colors to these hexagon tiles. And in order to do that, we can't just assign colors to this surface or these B-reps. In order to actually get it to render the colors, we need to convert them to meshes and assign colors to that. Surfaces generally don't like to actually get baked into Rhino, and therefore the rendering engine in Rhino isn't going to display them correctly. By converting them to meshes and applying colors to them, we can actually bake those colors directly into Rhino, and then our rendering engine will work correctly. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and convert this to a mesh. So I can just use the mesh B-rep component. You'll see that really the geometry doesn't change. It's just the type of geometry it is now. And then the next thing you'll see is that I've got mesh colors. Again, it's asking for the mesh, and then it's going to be asking for colors. Right now, it's got this default color arrangement, which creates this kind of weird looking radiation green happening on our landform. It looks cool in itself, but not exactly what we're trying to achieve. And so we can use some of the parameters that have already been generated here. So again, these are all based off of the slope. We can use that same parameter to create ourselves another transformation, in this case the coloring. So in order to do that, I'm going to go to parameters, input, and use the gradient. So the way this works is it's asking for your lower limit and your upper limit. That basically represents the two ends of this color spectrum. So the lower one's going to be this end of the spectrum, and then the upper one will be that end of the spectrum. It's asking for all the values that you're going to use to kind of assign these. So again, it's based off of the slope. So I'm going to drag that into there. And now it just needs to know what are those high limits and those low limits. So I can go to math, the bounds component to get my minimum and maximum. I can now deconstruct these values. So this is giving me my upper and lower limit values. And I can, again, so the ones that are flat are going to be one color, and then as they get steeper, it's going to transform into another color. So let's look at what happens if I just drag this into here. You're going to see that it's giving me actually the same number of colors as there are meshes, which is what we want, but it's basically trying to merge all 641 color values into each one of these. So in order for it to actually work correctly, we want to graph these for that, so that each color gets assigned to each mesh panel or mesh hexagon. So I'm just going to go ahead and disable or lock my solver for now so that nothing bad happens to this and it doesn't crash. So again, I'm just grafting both of those. Then I can enable, and you'll see now that they're a single color, and then as they get steeper, they get more to that red. So we want to first edit this a little bit. Like I said, if I don't want to show a lot of change, so these flat areas, I probably want to keep it a very simple color. So in that case, I'm just going to right click and make them all white. Commit changes, and now I can start to play more with my other color. And you can see that in order to start to affect those, I'm having to drag this pretty far over to get those other color ranges. And I'll even drag that all the way down, and that starts to look a lot better. You can add additional colors by clicking this gradient looking button and moving it over. So I'm just going to start to adjust these. Till I get something a little bit different. All right, so now I've got these kind of cool colors to show those different areas. And again, you can kind of continue. If you think there's too much color, we can just drag this white over a little bit more. Start to adjust it this way. So maybe it's only some of those areas that get this more purple color versus the other ones can get more of that pink gradient. So you can see there's a lot of kind of fluctuation and variation we can get in this new color scheme. So what's great about this, again, I've got a colored meshes. I've got a total of 641. I'm going to go ahead and bake that onto a new layer. So we'll bake it onto layer 2. I'll turn this off, and you'll notice that it actually shows these objects baked with the color. And that's exactly what we want, because now when we render it, it'll render it correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and change the name of this layer. We'll call it Colored Hex Mesh. There's a reason I'm starting to differentiate between objects that are surfaces and meshes for a step further down the line. But this is what we ultimately want to start to have. In order to, again, kind of show a nice high quality rendering, we want to decide where we want that viewport to be. So start to kind of orientate your drawing around. I want to show these actually in an axon view, so I'm going to right click, set view. I'm going to go to isometric, and I'm just going to pick one of these as it doesn't really matter because I can always orientate it and it'll keep the perspective or the view in parallel. So let's go for something like this. This starts to show me a lot. If I have it over here, I got this kind of ridgeline that's blocking a lot. It's kind of hard. I mean, I think it's going to be very difficult to show everything, but for now, this is looking pretty good. And I can get an idea of how this rendering is going to look by just going to render and do render preview. You can see that it's really gets kind of washed out. The colors even get a little bit different. So something you want to keep in mind is some of your rendering settings and how shadows start to play a role in this. So let's see what happens if I turn the sun on. I've got a skylight on. Let's turn that off. I get a different outcome when I do it that way. This where I just have the sun turned on, it's going to look a lot like what's getting previewed. So it doesn't really give us a whole lot of variation. If I turn the sun off and turn the skylight on, I get more of a diffused shadow versus having actual hard shadow edges. And depending on, again, your rendering properties, your ambient light is going to have a huge effect on this. Usually it's default to a pure black, and so let's just see what that looks like when I render it. So it really is kind of making those other walls gray. It's just a little too dark. And so I'm going to go back to render properties and change this ambient light to somewhere between the halfway and this absolute black. It doesn't take a lot of ambient light to really lighten up the image. So I'm going to stick within the range of like the 70s for now. Hit OK. And then I'll do render preview again. Now you'll see that those gray walls are a little bit more lightened up. I think that should be good for now. It's one of those things where you want to kind of tinker around with some of those settings. I'm going to go back to this one more time, just to kind of set some things up as well. Again, I want to make sure that I'm only rendering my landform with a transparent background, so make sure to have transparent background selected. There's also an export setting of once you render this to make sure that it's truly going to have a transparent background. The next thing is making sure that the resolution is of a high quality. Again, sometimes it's defaulted to these really low values. What I like to do is basically render what I see. So I just use the viewport here. Again, let's hit OK, and it's basically going to render everything here that's showing up in that viewport. But I actually want it to be at a higher resolution. So again, I can do a 300 dpi. What's cool is once you use the viewport, but if you want to do a higher resolution, you can now go to custom, and it'll keep your viewport ratio, and then you can lock it and increase these to a much higher value, and it'll, again, maintain your viewport. You can change this to a higher resolution. I'm going to keep it to normal for now. If you want it to have really crisp edges, you want to have that set to 10. Because I don't want this to take too long to render, I'm just going to keep it set to the normal, hit OK. Once I'm again satisfied with this viewport, right, I want to go ahead and right click, set view, name view, and save this. So landform hex render. So that way I can always move around in my model space and always revert back to the saved view. So let's go ahead and render it now. Hopefully it doesn't take too long. If it does, I can always edit the video so we aren't just staring at this for several minutes. Usually you can always close this and still work on it. In this case, it looks like it's kind of taking up everything, so we'll just let it do its thing. I'll most likely edit this part out so you don't have to sit through several minutes of this rendering. Okay, so now our rendering is complete, and you'll see that usually a good sign that you have the transparent background is that you have this black space on everything that isn't the actual geometry. But again, in order to make sure that you save it with a transparent background, we want to go to File, Save As, and make sure that our setting is set to a PNG. And now we can save it, so we'll do rendered hex, hit save. So now that will be set up. Something else that would be good to see with this, and again, kind of look at some other interesting elements of this, is applying or running the contour command. It'll actually capture all these details, which is cool. But this is, again, why it's important to manage your layers, because you'll see that when I just contour this combination of surfaces and meshes, that it's not actually going to produce what I was hoping for. So again, I'm just going to go ahead and select everything, type contour, find the base point. As long as I'm on one of those surfaces, it doesn't really matter. I want to make sure that I'm going in the upward direction, so I just change my view to the front, hold shift to keep it orthogonal and just point up, and go back to this, and then I can choose the distance between contours. So let's see what happens if I just do it for 2 feet. Doesn't really give me a lot of contours, so I'm gonna undo that. Again, I'm going to select everything, run the contour command, find the base, make sure it's going up, and now I'm going to do something more like, let's try 0.25. So it's going to take a minute. But you can see that now I've got a nice kind of dense set of contours. What I mentioned before is that there is going to be an issue with the contouring where it doesn't actually register the, it'll run it correctly, but again, in order to have it look appropriate in Illustrator, we want to make sure that the objects that are in the foreground, such as these, are actually going to mask out things in the background. And unfortunately, in Rhino 5, one second, so select object, I'm going to make sure to put all these curves on a separate layer, so I'll just change that to layer 4, call it contours. Okay, so again, I want to make sure I'm using that same view, so I'm going to go to View, Set View, Landform Hex. Now I want to, again, make sure I select everything. You can always kind of zoom out first, select everything, and then set my view, and type Make 2D. Make sure to use current view. In this case, it might get a little too busy showing the hidden line, so I'm going to turn that off and just keep the maintain source layers on. So I'm going to hit OK. Again, it's going to take a quick minute. But now I've got my Make 2D of my landform. So like I said, you can see that there's some really kind of busy line work happening where I've got those mesh hexagons, right? It's actually reading as a hollow piece instead of actually masking it. The ruled surfaces that were made as a surface, those do a good job of masking those things out. But the mesh for the Make 2D and Rhino 5 don't actually work with the Make 2D command. And I'll go ahead and keep this around just to show you the difference. So in order to get it to work correctly, and again, this is why the layer management isn't important, is that I want to also bake these hexagons as a surface themselves. So I've got those already there. So I'm going to turn them off. I'm going to hit bake. I'm going to bake these onto layer 3. Again, the geometry, they're pretty much identical between the meshes and the contours. However, how they work with some of the commands, in this case the make 2D, the meshes work appropriately. So I'm going to say this as hex top surface. And it doesn't matter that they don't have colors. We just want to have them for the make 2D command. So let's go back to say set view. Oops, sorry, I'm going to make sure I just have everything selected. Right click, set view. Here we go. And now I'll run make 2D again. Keep the same settings. So I've got the mesh turned off. It really doesn't matter whether it's on or off, but I do have that surface that I just baked on, because that's what's going to allow for the make 2D to work correctly. So now let's zoom and see the difference. So again, I can see that these areas are a lot less busy than here, right? I can see the contours behind it. So these start to, again, kind of clean those up. So as you can see, we've got all this different geometry and it's getting pretty busy. But let's not forget that we have our rendering of this landform, so we can really start to kind of filter out what we need and what we don't. We need to have certain layers turned on in order to, again, kind of clip things out, but we don't need to always export everything. So let's see what happens if I turn off those kind of ruled surfaces and turn off the blue hexagon top surfaces, and now I'm just left with the contours, which again have been trimmed out. So what we can do is actually just export these contours instead of everything else. So I would recommend from the make 2D is that you turn off the surfaces and just export the hexagons, because again, it's going to have a lot of geometry and a lot of things already going on, so sometimes less is more. So I'm going to now type export. Gonna put this in a new layer, call it landform contours. Save it as an Illustrator file. Okay. And now what I can do is I'll go into Illustrator. I'll go ahead and open up that rendering. So let's go to surface tiles, and this one was called where is it? Is it rendered hex? Open this. Right, so there's that image. And then I'm going to open those contours. Now just copy and paste them onto here, and Fortunately, I don't have a good reference point, but it shouldn't be too difficult to just scale it and match it still. I'll go ahead and just change that to be a much thinner line work. Get as close as possible. And just hit S to scale. So I have this kind of very end, and I want to just make sure that this end is also matching. Okay. So now I can see that. And again, what's good about it is that I've got the layers already made. I can actually assign the colors for this, for my contours. And now I've got a nice looking contoured surface as well, which again kind of shows just a lot of that kind of unique geometry.